or thesis for the National History Project, fitting the theme of conflict and compromises. The Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882, solved the conflict between the U.S. government and Chinese immigrants through stopping the immigrants from entering America, taking jobs from the older immigrants, and stopping the violence from the older immigrants towards the Chinese immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress and signed by President Chester A. Arthur in 1882. This act prohibited Chinese immigration, designed to eliminate Chinese laborers from taking white American jobs during a time of economic depression in the United States. Chinese laborers were discriminated against because they had been excluded opportunities based on their category rather than individual characteristics. Since all Chinese at the time were cheap laborers, meaning working for a less wage than other workers, there had been tension between most of the working class. It lasted for 10 years and was extended for another 10 years by the 1892 Gary Act, written by California Representative Thomas J. Gary and was passed by Congress on May 5, 1982. The Gary Act also required that Chinese would have to carry identification certificates or face deportations. Later measures placed a number of other restrictions on the Chinese, such as limiting their access to bail bonds. They could easily be thrown in jail or sent back to their home country. Here are some facts about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Most of the Chinese immigrants moved to the west coast of United States because of the gold rush and construction of the Continental Railroad, and they were greatly respected. It is also the first federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. In the mid-1840s, following defeat by Britain in the First Opium War, a series of natural catastrophes occurred across China, resulting in famine, peasant uprisings, and rebellions. Understandably, when the news of gold and opportunities in faraway America reached China, many Chinese seized the opportunity to seek their fortune. For the Chinese who began to come to America in the 1850s, California was known as the Gold Mountain. The gold rush was in full steam. For those who were not lucky with gold, there were jobs on the railroads or in factories. During the early stages of the gold rush, where surface gold was plentiful, and the Chinese were tolerated, if not well received. As gold became harder to find and competition increased, animosity towards the Chinese and the foreigners increased. Unlike immigrants from other countries, the Chinese didn't try to blend in with the American culture. In the picture on the right, we can see that they continued speaking Chinese, wearing traditional clothes, and building Chinatowns. As the number of Chinese laborers raised, they took over many old immigrants' jobs. They were more hardworking and loyal to their bosses. These immigrants were paid lower wages than white workers, who then blamed Chinese workers for driving down pay and taking away jobs. After the railroad was completed, and white laborers in other industries began to fear for their jobs, anti-Chinese attacks increased, including beating, arson, and murder. The political cartoon on the right reveals the ways white communities, represented by Uncle Sam, towards Chinese immigrants. The Chinese were no longer welcomed to America.
And they were considered to be very pliable labor, very inexpensive labor, labor that would work no matter what the circumstances were, no matter how dangerous it was.
Within 30 years, about 200,000 Chinese had settled in the U.S., but by the 1870s, a backlash against them had grown large and violent.
They faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of racial intolerance because they were seen as working for lower wages, taking jobs at a time when unemployment was 25–30% in some communities. The Chinese become the scapegoat for American workers on the West Coast especially for all the economic troubles.
The railroad companies turned against Chinese workers after they began to organize for better pay and a shorter workday. In 1867, when 5,000 Chinese Central Pacific Railroad workers went on strike, the companies simply cut off their food supplies until the starving workers agreed to return to work 1 week later.
And so there's the Throw the Chinese Out movement. Labor unions line up with it. The American Workingmen's Party is founded principally on this issue, and they pressure Congress, and Congress eventually agrees to pass its first immigration restriction law in 1882, explicitly targeting Chinese immigrants as undesirables.
The Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese laborers from immigrating to the United States for 10 years. It also prevented the Chinese already in the U.S. from becoming citizens. Congress renewed the law in 1892. And
tension between the United States government and China. Economic and cultural tension existed between the whites and Chinese due to American stereotyping and insulting of Chinese people in general. No more violence towards the Chinese in America. Anti-Chinese Americans had physically forced Chinese to flee before, since the Exclusion Act denied the Chinese normal rights like other immigrants and whites. They were no longer targeted as much as by the people rather than the government. Essentially, the discrimination continued over 40 years. Not violence anymore, but slings and verbal abuse were very common in newspapers, signs, and more. However, during World War II, China and America became allies. Both were mutual enemies against the Japanese in the 1930s. It took a long time for the Chinese to accept America's apology. There was a lot of America's damage to minorities in the past that was necessary to be repaired. The Geary Act in 1892 was extending the Chinese Exclusion Act by adding numerous new requirements. Now, they had to carry a resident permit, which was a sort of internal passport. The Chinese had to have proof that they were allowed to live and work in the United States to show that they were not illegal. This was much like a work visa, and they were not promised to become a permanent American citizen. The failure to carry the permit at all times was punishable by deportation or a year of hard labor. Hard labor was forced imprisonment and extensive manual work like building roads or working on the docks without being paid. Purely working for the government during their sentence without benefits. Also, the Chinese were forced to do the hard labor that no one else wanted to do. The Chinese were not allowed in court. Their cases would only be reviewed if a credible white witness was testifying. They were assumed to be not worth the U.S. government's time. Dennis Kearney was an Irish immigrant who settled in San Francisco and fought for workers' rights. He led strikes in protest of the growing number of imported Chinese workers who worked for less than the Americans. As a part of a competing immigrant race, he did not support the Chinese being employed more than people of other descent. He was a big part of Chinese discrimination during the 1870s with the slogan, "The Chinese must go," that intimidated employers into refusing to hire Chinese. The impact of this event was illegal Chinese immigrants coming through Mexico to America. This became the first illegal immigration. Immigrants chose to go through an easier way than gaining permission that was almost impossible. Effects of the event. Restricted Chinese immigration led to less immigrant workers from China and many social implications. Consequences of this turning point in history. This pointed out discrimination and inferiority of whites in America when they could not find any jobs. Eventually, they continued discrimination towards other immigrants. The Chinese Exclusion Act ended, but there was still racism towards the Chinese. Like many minorities, most immigrants have assimilated into American culture in order to prevent feeling alienated. Warren G. Magnuson repealed. Warren Magnuson repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 by winning over the areas where most anti-Chinese sentiment accumulated over time. Magnuson Act of 1943. Chinese immigrants were no longer put at a set limit per year. Also, immigration was no longer based on just race and class. It was a turning point in history because it was the first significant law that restricted immigration into the United States of an ethnic working group. These actions to exclude a whole race was not prevented at all and took until the 1940s to repeal. How it connects today. Trump's proposal on immigration restriction is a similar event today. As a country built by immigrants, we shouldn't restrict immigration of hardworking immigrants. Many deserve the jobs that they earned by consistently being diligent.